My name's Professor Judith Hawley, and I'm the chair for another in the London Luminaries lecture series. The London Luminaries is a voluntary organisation that represents a group of historic properties working together to explore the history of the West of London. Each property provides the speaker, and we provide a platform for them. And as you probably know, if you miss anything, we have a recording on YouTube, and you can see a huge library of past recordings on YouTube too. We also usually have a theme for each season of talks, but this year our partners are deciding what they want to showcase in their presentations. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, let me remind you to type your questions into the chat at any point, and I will put them to the speaker on your behalf at the end. Our speaker tonight is the community archaeologist Alexis Haslam. He joined Fulham Palace Trust in May 2017. He's recently published an article on the excavations of the site of the Fleet Prison in Farringdon Street in a journal called The Transactions of the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society. I'm very pleased to say that his monograph on the archaeology of Fulham Palace is now entering the editing stage, and we all look forward to reading it when it's published.
Thank you very much, Judith. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly and see my slides. But yes, what I thought would be an interesting topic of conversation today was more about the staff that worked and lived at Fulham Palace. So I've entitled my talk Upstairs, Downstairs, a view of the lives of the residents and servants of the palace. So I think having done a lot of research for the Fulham Palace monograph, which is currently in the editing stage, funnily enough, one of the more interesting aspects that's come out of it is understanding the fact that the palace was, of course, a working estate and required a lot of staff. And whereas often our historical knowledge of the palace is based around the structures that the bishops leave behind, the bishops themselves, and sort of what the bishops themselves got up to, it's kind of interesting to take another look at the other people that worked and lived here, some of whom actually stayed for longer than a number of the bishops. So as we can see here, here's our very famous Tudor courtyard at Fulham Palace, a really nice picture drawn by the architect John Chestle Buckler, who was rather an interesting character in himself and was almost at the time sort of recording structures and buildings before they kind of disappeared. Fortunately, obviously Fulham Palace didn't, but he's rather a wonderful illustrator as well as an architect. So a really nice picture, but again, sort of supports the fact, I suppose, that a lot of our interpretation is based upon the structures, the buildings, and the bishops. So understanding who lived and who worked at the palace can often be quite tricky. We know, looking at this plan from 1762, I think, by the architect Stifford Leadbetter, that there was a housekeeper's wing attached to the Tudor courtyard. Sadly, no longer there. It was knocked down in the 1760s, shortly after this plan was drawn. But the housekeeper was obviously a very important individual and employee at the palace. And it looks like this structure was actually added onto the Tudor courtyard, which was built between 1493 and 1495, at some point in the early 16th century, standing until demolition in the 1760s. And this would have been home to, I had to actually look up how to pronounce this word, the seneschal, or the estate manager. So that's quite a high-ranking member of the household, and they would have had their own sort of wing, as it were, that they lived in, presumably with their families. But tracing the people that lived in these buildings and tracing the people that worked at the palace is actually quite difficult. So when the architect Stifford Leadbetter was asked to make alterations to the palace in the 1760s, he drew some really fantastic plans, and this has been really, really helpful for us there at the Lambeth Palace Library. And he did a really nice drawing of the stable block, and this records the housekeeper's wing that you can see there in the right hand of the picture as Allen's house. But unfortunately, that's quite a common name, and trying to trace someone called Allen from 1762 is really, really difficult. We've also had mentions of people earlier in history. So we know that when Bishop Juxon was Bishop of London between 1633 and 1646, that an individual named Abraham Haynes was living at the palace, and he seems to have been sort of an employee of Juxon's as well. And a close associate, and he was a witness on several land leases associated with the bishop, but again, quite a difficult individual to trace. There's a few things that may suggest that he was involved again with sort of property and land deals, but again, quite difficult to look back into the records and try and find someone with fairly common name. And another great thing that's cropped up is the fact that some of these bishops kept really rather wonderful accounts. Again, going through Lambeth Palace Library, Bishop Terrick kept really, really clear accounts, as you can see on the right-hand picture there. And this, interestingly, is a list of individuals who were employed at the palace to mow the warren, which is now the meadow allotments. So essentially, they were mowing it and making hay, and this was in June of 1767. So we've got a whole list of individuals there who were employed to mow the grass and make hay. And this seemed to be some kind of an annual event, which the bishop liked to observe with guests that he invited down from the main palace building as some kind of weird rustic entertainment, watching the peasants, I suppose, mow his lawn, technically, and make hay. But the individuals in there, that would be a good project to try and trace them. But again, 1767 could be quite difficult. So obviously things become much, much easier from a tracking perspective with the census. So we know that in 1851, looking at the census on the right-hand side there, that the palace had at least 18 servants working in it. And that included positions such as gardeners, housekeepers, laundry maids, ladies' maids, along with kitchen staff, a dairymaid, a butler, a footman, and a coachman. So this is a working estate. It's quite a large property, Fulham Palace. The bishop's obviously got his house in London, near St Paul's, but his sort of summer residence, as it were, is the palace, and it's got quite a lot of staff working in it. So this becomes an interesting aspect for us now to try and work out who was working here and really what happened to them as individuals and how their lives progressed, which is a really interesting way of looking at social history. So one of the most interesting aspects that I found, particularly during the research of our project, was the coachman who worked at the palace. And I think one of the main reasons I got quite interested in this was the fact that we had to do quite a lot of work on our stable block, which is actually quite a complicated building. So that gave us an insight into looking at the people that would have worked within the stable block, and in particular the coachman. So going back to our census records again, the first coachman that we actually know of was in 1851, and that was a man named Richard Higgs. And interestingly, he was a former labourer. And it's almost as though he gained the position of coachman at the palace simply because he lived close by, and he possibly worked on a part-time basis for the bishop. But by 1861, he'd actually moved to Hounslow with his family and become a market gardener. So it may be that he just treated that position as coachman as a stopgap. But come 1861, again, trying to look at the staff that were working at the palace, on the date that the census was actually taken, there weren't many people there. And that seems to be because Bishop Tate at that time was actually staying at the Lord Warden Hotel, which you can see there on the right-hand side, down in Dover. And there weren't actually many staff at the palace on that day. So it may be that the coachman was down there with Bishop Tate. He obviously wasn't staying in the Lord Warden Hotel because we can't find them in there, but maybe they were staying at a cheaper accommodation nearby. This was a huge hotel built by the railway company and often used as a stop before heading over to France. So whether the bishop and his family were often their way over to France at the time, we're not really sure, but it's certainly a possibility. So come the next census, 1871, we find that the coachman was a man named William Hill, and he was living at the palace at this time with his wife, Charlotte, and his two daughters. But going back 10 years earlier, that family were actually living above the stables at the Bishop of Lincoln's palace, which you can see on the left-hand side. So quite often in these situations, you'll see the bottom of the stable block, as you can see there, was where the horses lived, and the coachman or the stable grooms, etc., and their families would live above the stables in residences above them. So you can see that this is the Bishop of Lincoln's palace at the time, Riseholme Hall, and that family, the Hill family, were obviously living there. But when Bishop John Jackson, who was the Bishop of Lincoln in 1861, was promoted to Bishop of London in 1869, he actually took the coachman with him. So this entire family had to move with the bishop from Lincoln, where presumably their lives were based, to Fulham to come and work as coachman at Fulham Palace. So often the situation is that not just the bishop moves, but often he takes several of or a number of his servants with them, and they have to up and move with him. So that can be, or presumably was, quite an interesting aspect of what the lives were like for these servants. They were almost part of the family, I suppose. And when William Hill died, his wife and daughters actually moved to Clapham. But moving on to the next year, in the next census in 1891, we have a coachman named Alfred Wood. He was married to a woman named Mary, and they had 3 children. So they were residing at the palace. And he was coachman to Bishop Frederick Temple. But again, Temple was promoted to Archbishop of Canterbury. That's Temple on the right-hand side there in 1896. And again, the family moves with him. So the Wood family moved with Bishop Temple to presumably Lambeth Palace, and they may have worked down in Canterbury as well. And actually, Alfred Wood remained at Lambeth and was coachman to Temple's successor, Randall Davidson, as well, after Temple passed away. So Davidson obviously took him on as a coachman too. So we are seeing these coachmen moving with the bishops as they gain promotion. But perhaps the most interesting family that we've had at the palace to look at was the Burley family, and that's simply because the Burleys were at Fulham Palace for such a long time and have a really, really long relationship with it. So the main character in all of this initially is John, or Jack, that you can see there sitting down on the left-hand side, looking quite stern, with his family photograph taken outside Gothic Lodge, which, if you know Fulham Palace, is the pink house by the bridge. And he's first recorded as coachman at the palace in 1901, when he was 37 years old. He was married to Kate, who you can see there sitting down as well on the right-hand side. And at the time that he became, or in the 1901 census, he had a number of children, including John Jr., that you can see there in the top left, Edith, just next to John Jr., Henry, who sadly isn't in the photo, as we'll find out in a bit, William in 1897, you can see in the top right-hand corner, and Evelyn, who's right in the middle there. She was born in 1899. So a large family. And working out when Burley was employed at the palace was also quite an interesting thing to look into, because when Henry, his son, was baptised in 1895, the Burley family were in fact living at 50 Reeves Mews on the eastern side of Hyde Park. But when John Jr. was admitted to Ackmar Road School in Fulham in January 1897, they were residing at the palace. So it seems most likely that Jack Burley was employed as coachman by the Bishop Mandell Creighton, who was Bishop of London between 1897 and 1901. Sadly, Mandell had some health issues and he passed away in 1901, but the Burleys remained. So it seems most likely that despite the photograph of the Burleys outside the Pink House, as it is Gothic Lodge, they probably resided in this building, which is directly opposite Gothic Lodge, if you know Fulham Palace, and known as Coachman's Lodge. So this building, although not looking quite as fancy as the Gothic Lodge building, was built by the architect William Butterfield in 1892. He's quite important at the palace because he built our chapel in 1867, and this is likely to have been one of his last constructive works as he retired shortly afterwards. So it almost seems that since the early 19th century and the construction of Gothic Lodge, which was built by Bishop Hooley in the very early 19th century, there's been a decision, or there was a decision, to construct more outbuildings to provide more lodgings for servants and their families. So it seems almost as if buildings were being built specifically for servants, rather than just relying on any space there was within the palace itself. But the Burley family were heavily linked to horsemanship, I suppose. So Burley was born in Westerham down in Kent, but his father was also a coachman, and he actually grew up later on in Chelsea. His wife, Kate, Her father was also a coachman as well, and they lived at 15 Sussex Mews near Regent's Park, which you can see here in this image from Google Earth. But those buildings are still there, which I find really interesting because mews generally developed as a means of housing horses, and they're quite often behind grand buildings. So again, the principle works in the same way that you see the stables at the grand houses, where one of the questions we often ask in archaeology is where were all the horses? There must have been loads of horses in London, and obviously they were in these mews. So the coachmen and their families were often again living above the stable blocks, which are hidden behind the main houses in these mews, as they're called. And it's really interesting to see that these mews have been converted and are probably quite well sought after properties these days, I would imagine. So again, it was certainly a large family, and a number of the Burghley children will have been born at the palace, and they had further children. Alfred was born in 1901, Alice in 1903, George in 1905, and Frank in 1907. But as I did mention earlier, Henry, who was baptized in 1895, was not in the photograph, and that's sadly because he died at the age of 11 in 1906. And again, tragedy followed with the family when William, who you can see outside Gothic Lodge in the top right-hand corner, he was killed immediately prior to the Somme offensive in June 1918 whilst he was serving with the Royal Engineers. And this is a picture of him as a young man having joined the army and the Royal Engineers, sadly before he died. And that must have been quite a difficult time for the Burghley family because Fulham Palace was actually being used as a hospital for wounded soldiers at the time. It's the Freemasons Hospital #2. And as you can see in this image here, these are all the soldiers and the nurses as well, dining within the Great Hall at Fulham Palace. And we've actually done quite a lot of work at the palace into researching these soldiers and nurses, mostly because Sister Mary Latchmore, you can actually see right in the middle of the photo there at the bottom of the main plaque, we have a scrapbook from when she worked here. So that's almost another, it's an entire lecture in itself, that one. But that was really interesting too. But again, it must have been difficult for the Burghleys because the bishop at the time who they worked for, Arthur Winnington Ingram, he'd been a huge advocate of the war and heavily encouraged young men to sign up and join the army and to go and fight on the Western Front. So it would have been interesting to know really what the Burghleys' feelings were about that, having lost their son. And in another strange twist, William is actually buried at the Purnoy British Cemetery in France. And this was designed by Sir Reginald Blomfield, who also designed the Menin Gate and was the grandson of the former Bishop of London, Charles Blomfield. So it's likely that Reginald Blomfield probably knew the palace fairly well as well. But these must have been quite interesting times as well for Jack Burghley, and that he'd spent his entire working life from growing up around his father as well, working with horses and being involved in looking after horses and caring for horses and their welfare. But by 1911 on the census, he's recorded as a chauffeur. So this is a huge change that must take place in that the bishop, Arthur Winnington Ingram, seems to have shifted from using horses and horse-drawn carriages to cars at some point, I think between 1904, 1905 and 1909. And that must have brought a wealth of issues if you've spent your entire career working with horses and looking after horses, and now you're expected to drive and maintain a motor vehicle. And this was Bishop Winnington Ingram's, it's a Sunbeam 1914, apparently 1216, I think. I had to send the photograph to some kind of old school kind of motor enthusiast magazine to try and find out what it was. So they suggested it was this Sunbeam. It's rather an impressive vehicle, I think. But obviously Jack wasn't going to work forever. So it's not exactly clear when he retired. But when his daughter Evelyn was married in 1923, she was recorded as living at 21 Revenue Gardens, and that's on Putney. And I've put a little red marker there, and you can see it's directly opposite Fulham Palace. So it wasn't exactly like the Burghleys moved further away. And this is the same address that Alice was living at in 1927 when she was married, and her father at the time was recorded as a retired steward living at the same address. So presumably the Burghley family Simply, once Jack retired, they moved over to Putney and lived in Rumney Gardens. And again, probably maintained good links with the palace, seeing as they were directly opposite it on the other side of the river. But funnily enough, Jack's son, John, then took on the position. So John Burley Jr., we saw in that photograph outside Gothic Lodge, he became the new chauffeur to the Bishop of London. And in 1929, he's recorded as living at the New Lodge in Fulham Palace, presumably again coachman's. And he had married a woman named Fernande Hippolyte Dubray in Saint-Omer on the 1st of February 1919. Now, this has been a difficult one to try and understand. I can't find any sort of records of John Burley Jr. operating within the armed forces in World War One, but it does seem rather odd that he was in France in 1919, and it's quite possible that that link is simply due to the fact that, like so many young men at the time, he was stationed in France. But interestingly, Fernand and John's son, Eric Louis Burley, he would go on, who was born in 1922, would go on to become a leading sports journalist for Agence France Presse. Obviously, he was bilingual because his mother was French, so he'd grown up speaking French as well. And he became quite a famous sports journalist. So he was well known for covering Roger Bannister's sub-4-minute mile in 1954. So again, another really interesting twist to the Burley family. And although sadly this isn't the greatest photograph we have of John Burley Jr., this is quite a nice photograph anyway of him with Winnington Ingram's brand new Austin limousine, which apparently had been presented to him by the clergy and the laity of his diocese in commemoration of 25 years service. So that would make the photograph about 1926. So John Jr. Has probably been chauffeur to the bishop for about 3 years, I think. And the photo, also interesting, was taken by a man named Bill Brunel, who was a well-known motorcar photographer. So I've tried chasing this image a little bit. I can't quite work out where it comes from. It's on our system at work, but it's probably from some kind of motoring magazine at the time, I would imagine. And again, a rather impressive vehicle that the bishop was being driven around in. So obviously, the Burleys at this point have been working for Winnington Ingram, but he retired in 1913 and Bishop Fisher was made Bishop of London. And in her memoirs, Lady Fisher, you can see on the sofa there, sitting in what's now our cafe, said that he'd already been chauffeur for about 20 years. So again, puts it around 23, 24, something like that. And she was quite fond of John. She described him as a great character. And funnily enough, it was John who received and delivered the letter from Winston Churchill announcing that Bishop Fisher had been made Archbishop of Canterbury. So he played quite a significant role in the Fisher's family lives. And perhaps one of the funniest incident that Lady Fisher recalls is that Bishop Fisher's car was actually out of action at one point. So John had to drive Bishop Fisher, the Archbishop Cyril Garbett, who was Archbishop of York, William Temple, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, to a meeting together. So because the car, or Bishop Fisher's car, wasn't working, they had to borrow Lady Fisher's car, which was the Morris 8, not the one you can see on the right hand side, but that's in for reference. But unfortunately, the combined weight of England's most senior Anglicans was too much for the little Morris, and the axle broke on it. So that must have been quite an amusing incident, and I wonder how they actually made it to the meeting in the end. But John was, in all likelihood, the last coachman or chauffeur at Fulham Palace. And he's recorded as still living there in 1956. So by that point, the Burleys as a family would have served Winnington Ingram, Fisher, Wand, and Montgomery Campbell, with the last Bishop of London leaving Fulham Palace in 1973. The image on the right-hand side is what is now our education centre, but of course formerly was the stable block. So this is where somewhere where Jack Burley and John Burley would have spent a lot of time with horses to begin with, and then the stable block itself was also converted into a garage as the motor car became the primary means of transport. And the carriage room was where the cars were stored, and there is, I believe, an inspection pit underneath the floor as it is now. So you can see how buildings had to change as well as life moved on, as it were. But that covers the coachman, I suppose. An interesting aspect to the palace. But perhaps the other most significant, or one of the most significant positions at the palace, and particularly given our botanical history, was of course the head gardener. And again, this was another long-serving member of the bishop's household. They'd have had gardeners there for many, many years. And this photo from 1881 shows what was our tithe barn. So the tithe barn is believed to have been built in about 1652, but it also formed the living quarters of the head gardener and their family. So this was still the case by the beginning of the Second World War, when the gardener at the time, David Sutherland, was still living in it. So apart from going back to Compton's time and knowing that George London was supposed to be his gardener, one of the gardeners that we can actually put a name to at Fulham Palace was David Wall Cunningham. So this is a photo of him on the left-hand side later in his life. Sadly, he died quite young. He was only 57 when he passed away. But he'd been born in Prestonpans in 1820 and married Martha Ferguson in Carmonach. So of Scottish ancestry, Scottish descent. But he moved south and he's recorded as a gardener at Thirklebury in Yorkshire in 1851. But by 1861, he's at the palace and he's the gardener, or the head gardener, to Bishop Tate, who would go on to be Archbishop of Canterbury, but is also a fellow Scot. So I don't know whether that had any impact on him gaining the position of head gardener for the Bishop of London at Fulham Palace. But with his wife, with Martha, they did have two children. Sadly, David died before his first birthday. But their daughter Caroline lived to be 80 years old. She married and she ended up living in, or married to a dairy farmer down in Lewisham. So she moved sort of southeast, as it were. But one of the nice things, or the images that we've seen from the Cunningham family, is the fact that David Cunningham was gifted a clock by the Tates in 1867. I'm not exactly sure why, but I presume this was probably for 10 years service, maybe. But obviously Tate was translated to Canterbury in January 1868. But in this instance, the Cunningham family didn't actually move with him. And instead, David moved on to work as head gardener at Moor Park in Rickmansworth, which was the manor of Robert Grosvenor, who was the first Baron Ebury. But still, from the Cunningham family, we have this rather fantastic photograph of Martha and Caroline. I'm not sure what they're sitting on there, but it looks like some kind of swing type contraption. But again, as I said, sadly, David passed away in 1877 at only 57 years old. But by that point, I think Caroline was married and had moved southeast. So the tithe barn had obviously been home to gardeners at Fulham Palace for quite a long time, or the western end of it had at least, but it did suffer some bomb damage during the Second World War. So you can see the photo of it earlier from 1881. By the sort of post-war, it was looking in quite a sorry state. And Bishop Fisher wrote to his wife on the 26th of September 1940, John, and presumably John being again John Burley there, and the Sutherlands, the gardeners, or the head gardener and his family, are all using the old kitchen, and the Sutherlands are using the packing room as a bedroom. So clearly they had to be forced out of their living accommodation by damage to the tithe barn. And when they say the old kitchen, I think they probably mean Bishop Sherlock's room, as it is now. So the tithe barn, given the state that it was in after the war, was declared unsafe by the council and was pulled down. But the palace did, of course, gain some war damage money from that, and the new lodge, or a new lodge, was constructed following the demolition of the barn and built again specifically for the head gardener at a cost of £4,231, 3 shillings and 11 pence. So this is what we call Timber Lodge. It still stands today, and it's still occupied as well, though not anymore by the head gardener. So this was David Sutherland. He was head gardener at the palace until August of 1961. So he was forced out during the bombing and had to move in with his family, presumably into the palace buildings. But again, quite an interesting fact that he was originally from Scotland, much like one of his predecessors, the Cunningham, David Wall Cunningham. So David Sutherland was born in Carnoustie, served his apprenticeship in Fife before moving south in 1926. He gained a position at Palace in 1936. And at that time, again, much like the Burleys, he served 4 bishops and witnessed increased mechanisation. So when he first started, he actually had 6 gardeners working beneath him. But when he left, they were down to just 2. But funnily enough, head gardener is one of the few positions at the palace that survives to this day, along with the estate manager. And happily, now the garden team have increased in size. So we're going up in numbers again rather than the reduction that happened from the sort of 1940s, 50s and 60s onwards. But one last aspect I'd quite like to look at is the fact that not always is it just servants that work at the palace, but other people come in as well. And during World War II, the Fulham Palace site was actually used as a barrage balloon position. So although the barrage balloon you can see in the left-hand picture there is not above Fulham Palace, it's actually, you can see Putney Bridge just above it and Wandsworth Park just below the barrage balloon. So the palace is just behind it. But on the 15th of October 1942, a balloon site was established at Fulham Palace, and this was 904/5 Squadron, and the location was 424. So this meant changes at the palace, and that we had some people coming in to live at the palace who wouldn't have resided at somewhere like that before. And the balloon site was staffed by the WAFs, and again, they actually lived above the arch, if you know the palace well, that leads directly into the courtyard, and they ate in Gothic Lodge. So Gothic Lodge became, at the time, a kind of a mess hall almost for the WAFs during World War II. And they had some interesting visitors. On the 23rd of March 1943, the Queen came to visit. She had initially gone to Fulham Palace to visit some of the women lay church workers who'd been appointed to work amongst women in the forces. But I think Bishop Fisher quite enjoyed having the WAFs around, and he used to quite often enjoy them or invite them over for Sunday tea. And you can see them being inspected here by the Queen, or the Queen Mother as she became later on. And Bishop Fisher, funnily enough, also kept a bomb map, which was quite useful. So you can see in this map, in the top right corner where the sort of orange splodge is, that the balloon cottage was actually hit by a bomb. So Gothic Lodge was hit by a bomb, but fortunately this didn't go off. Although the bishop did, of course, lose his greenhouses just by the walled garden, which meant that all his cucumbers and melons were destroyed, which seemed to have caused him a bit of upset. But we have had, or we did receive a letter from one of the WAFs that was positioned here or stationed here in World War II. And she said that the room above the Tudor arch would often become quite cold, as you can imagine, because there's nothing beneath it. And they often used to pinch a log or two from the bishop's firewood stock. And she came close to being caught once. But this is rather a nice photo that she sent to us as well. So she was called Maureen Knapp, or born Maureen Knapp. She later became Maureen Dolphin after she got married. But as a young woman from Sunderland, she was stationed at the palace as a leading aircraft woman for about a year in 1944. And she seemed to really actually enjoy her time here. She mentioned in a letter that she sent in 1991 that she had very fond memories of working with the WAF and of being at Fulham Palace, and really enjoyed particularly going over to Putney for dancing, funnily enough, as you can imagine, being young and footloose and fancy free at the time. But Putney did, of course, suffer quite a serious bombing incident just before Maureen arrived at the palace. And the 7th of November 1943, there was a busy crowd in the Cinderella Dance Hall, or dance club at the time, on the corner of Putney High Street and Putney Bridge Road. That was hit at 9:02 p.m., which was really busy. It was absolutely packed, and resulted in 81 people being killed, and 248 people being injured. So, Palace at wartime, although it suffered very little damage itself, I think you can see that the area around it suffered from some quite serious damage and loss of life. And that really brings me to the end of the lecture. Here are the WAFs again. You can see Maureen on the right hand side there in the at the back of Gothic Lodge. But I think like what's been really interesting aspect of a lot of this research, particularly as I've been undertaking work into the monograph, is not just understanding the archaeology, the architecture, the structure, and the buildings, as well as the bishops themselves, but looking into the people that lived and worked here too. So looking into people like the Waffs and the Burleys, and also looking at architects like Stiff Ledbetter and employees that they had, and the contributions that they made to essentially what the palace is today. And I think these people are really significant, and they play a really important part on the history of the palace and how it's moved forward through time. So hopefully you enjoyed the lecture, and that brings me to the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexis, for that wonderful talk. Just what a rich sense we get of the importance of these places. You know, they're still there, and our Luminaries partners are very keen to make sure that they're relevant to people's lives, that we can visit them and that we can find connections with them, and a commitment, as you've shown very much tonight, Alexis, to understanding more fully how these places have survived because of all the work that was being done by the people who lived and worked there.
Yeah, that's a great story.
So thank you, Alexis, and thank you also to our wonderful audience. You are the best. Thank you so much, and I hope to see some of you next time when we have our speaker Nadej from Chiswick House. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.